Hello everyone, and welcome to the Shakespearean Shrew. I am your Shakespearean Shrew, Karen Feiner, professor from the University of Oklahoma and lover of all things bard. This podcast is going to be a decorum-be-damned entrance into understanding Shakespeare's stages, where there are many, and all the players on it. Today we are at the Mermaid Tavern with Kris Kuss, who is a director, a fight director, and actor, staged as... Damn it! I'm just starting at the Mermaid Tavern. I don't want to say the whole thing again. Today we are at the Mermaid Tavern with Kris Kuss, who is director, fight director, actor, stage combat instructor, theater educator, and associate professor of movement at Oklahoma City University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And he comes with swords, so that just makes it so much better. We like him so much.
I go everywhere with swords.
I mean, that might be the coolest thing ever.
I might also have a pocket knife.
He's ready for
Some
anything.
other knives.
Don't mess with this guy. So, okay, you recently have done the stage choreography for Cowboy Macbeth at the Oklahoma Shakespeare in the park, and at the Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park. That was much better. So this is an interesting one because it takes 11th century warlords and their swords and turns it into a 19th century battle with quick draw, guns and daggers. And so obviously the fight choreography has to shift dramatically from an 11th century telling to a 19th century
Absolutely,
telling.
yes.
So what's your process for getting to understand a production and determining how to approach that particular choreography?
With any show I'm working on as a fight director, and I do use that term specifically, fight director, because I don't think what I'm doing is just coming in and giving movement. The fight choreography, the work that's being done, this physical storytelling is just that, it's storytelling. And so it does need to serve the character development, it needs to fit within the world of the play, it needs to mesh with the character's objectives in the moment. And so one of the first things I do is I just have a conversation with the director, like, what is the concept, the idea? And for this show, I spoke with Justin and Belle and Dylan about their concept of this Western Macbeth, which I was very excited about. I thought, that's great. Take this 11th century period where it was very much just these lords, these various rulers of just their domains in Scotland, and they're all kind of working together, and they're really blended with this idea of a frontier life, of claiming land, holding land, and trying to exert some kind of ownership over it. And that was one of the first things that they expressed to me, was they were interested in the idea of generational, recursive, repeated violence, and the nature of violence as it just passes from one generation to the next, one century to the next, one era, one people group to the next. And so in many ways, that simplifies the process for me, because I don't really, I don't have to make it more complicated than what it is. At the end of the day, regardless of whether we're using guns or big broadswords or little swords or knives or whatever, or just a stick and a rock, this is still the story of ambition, of these flawed characters who are, whether, depending on how you read the play, if you're reading it as like they were forced into it, or merely they were just given that little push to indulge their own darker sides. It doesn't really matter where it takes place, the story is still the same, and that was something I was very intrigued by, and I thought that was, when they said that was something that immediately I grabbed onto. As far as the logistics of staging something for a Western setting with fights, we're in a very small space. For anyone who hasn't seen the show yet or isn't planning to see the show, we are in a very, very intimate space, and one of the first things I made sure to let the directors know ahead of time is we cannot have live gunfire in that space. We,
the audience, appreciate you.
Yes, it would just be far too loud. Even the smallest, tiniest little acorn blanks that you can get would still be overwhelmingly powerful in that space. We do have one shot in the space that is a sound cue, and it works just fine. But we were kind of I was very interested in the idea, well, these characters can be walking around with guns on their hips all the time. How can we justify them not just pulling out a gun and shooting someone every time they just want to kill them? That deals again with the same problem that we would have, like noise and also safety. We're now in the 21st century where people are very aware and sensitive to the realities of guns, and we have to be mindful of that. Also, the fact that it's a very wide space, but there are audience members on the side that limits where you can point the gun, so you're not accidentally pointing it at an audience member. All of that then led to the idea of, well, these are frontiersmen. They wouldn't just have guns; they would have knives on them as well. And we have some bowie knives, we have some smaller knives, we have various sizes, and so we were playing around with the idea of, like, someone goes to pull a gun, and then someone runs it and jams the gun up. They're wrestling over it, and in the process of wrestling, they pull a knife, and there's a lot of reasons that we came up with for various moments to justify why they're not just shooting each other at every option, at every opportunity. It's because it's not a film.
Right.
So we can sometimes, I like it because those obstacles actually create a lot of wonderful opportunities.
So you mentioned something that I think is really important, which is the violence that seems to not necessarily be new, but be something that is very currently plaguing our society.
Yes.
And so as a fight director, as somebody who walks around with, swords and daggers for part of your job, it's your job, and probably part of, you as a person, I imagine. How do you differentiate between the artistry of telling a story through these moments of violence and just the violence itself?
I'm not going to lie and say that the work I do isn't fun. We're now at the end of the summer. I just came back from my second stage combat workshop of the summer, where I go for 2 weeks and I get to work with mostly college-age students who are just thrilled to pick up swords. And yeah, it's a lot of fun playing with them, and we're working all day long, and then they're testing in them, and they're getting to learn fights and put them to scene work, and they get really invested, and it's a blast. Fight camp is a blast, and I love doing it. But something that I tell them, something I tell my students in my regular classes at the university, I for one, just a little about me, I'm not someone who really enjoys violence. Like, I enjoy the odd, I enjoy superhero movies and I enjoy that kind of thing, but it's when it's very stylized. But the actual stories of violence, more particularly the use of violence, I'm not in favor of. I'm actually very much a pacifist. And yet, yes, it's very odd that then I'm the person who has the knives and the sword. These are stories that are necessary. If we're going to tell stories of conflict, there needs to be just that, conflict. And conflict comes in a variety of shapes and sizes. And the moments when characters stop speaking and start fighting, that means the words have run out. They've run out of things to say. The arguments are done, and now they're resorting to our basest instincts as human beings. And if we're going to tell those stories, I see it as my duty to teach the actors how to do it safely in a way that respects each other, respects the story, and doesn't put anyone in danger. So in many ways, I feel like what I'm doing is actually working against violence, working against things that would put people in harm's way. I think it's a duty that I serve as to foster peace and cooperation, because really, all of stage combat, one of our biggest tenets that we say is that it's not violence, it's not theatrical violence, it's really the illusion of violence. It is creating the illusion of people doing grievous harm to one another. And to effectively tell that story, we need to make it seem authentic, to have those emotional beats land for the audience, to give the actors motivation to move on to the next thing, whatever that next moment is. But at the end of the day, these are collaborative stories. We're using collaborative techniques and respect and communication to create the illusion of breakdowns of communication to create the illusion of conflict when in actuality we're working together. At its heart, stage combat is actually two people moving at the same time, in the same direction, telling the same story. If I put an actor on stage and I tell them, yeah, just swing your fist at them and try to dodge it, that's not two people moving at the same time in the same direction. They're actually moving opposed to each other, and that's where you get injuries and you get bad storytelling. It's messy for the wrong reasons, and it doesn't serve the story effectively, and no one should pay me for that. No one should pay to see that. But in actuality, it seems like it's a paradox, but I view the work that I do as actually very much in service of fostering communication, collaboration, in our artists.
I think that is a great way to look at it, because with Shakespeare, and I guess I'll preface my comment with another question, which is there a difference between doing choreography and directing for a Shakespeare play versus any other production?
A bit, yeah. I mean, one of the things we all understand with Shakespeare is that the characters, I think it's a little reductionist to say that they have no subtext because they're still human beings, but just the reality of the text is they are saying out loud their feelings. If a character turns to the audience and says, "I hate that guy," we believe him. If a character says to another character, "You're my best friend," we believe him until he turns to the audience and says, "Actually, I hate that guy." They'll always tell us how they feel. They'll always let us know. And likewise, in many ways, that makes it very easy for staging fights, because then I know exactly the point of view. Yeah, there's room for interpretation. You have this play being a perfect example of that. There's always rooms for interpretation and ways that you can explore how do they get there, or like in this production, the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is a little different than the last time I worked on Macbeth. There's always some little nuances they can play with, but at the end of the day, these characters in Shakespeare, they're very to the point and very direct. So for staging fights, that makes it very easy. What is their motivation? Well, they literally just told me. For staging for more contemporary plays, sometimes there's a lot more room for some nuance or some differentiation between one production and the next, because one director might take it a completely different way, and they don't want it to be brutal. They want it to be a little more hesitant, or maybe they want it to be like cold and calculating and almost surgical, as opposed to another person wants it to be wild with abandon. There's a lot of room for interpretation there, and there still is in Shakespeare. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what is the story that we all have agreed to tell together, and then I approach it in whatever way I can to serve that story and to support the work that the actors have already done, and to make it make sense for them.
So I teach more the language of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Love the combat, love the fight scenes, think they're beautiful. But and I think that's the term, beautiful, that I would use. And I'm just curious about how the rhythm of the fight scenes works with or against the rhythm of Shakespeare's language.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because you mentioned that you love the language, and then when you read Shakespeare, the vast majority of the time it just says, "and then they fight," and then they fight. Edmund falls, whatever, so it's our job as fight directors to fill in the gaps into how we find the rhythm for that, and the rhythms are different. Whereas, as you know, in Shakespeare's language, the rhythm of the verse, it mimics the natural rhythm that's inherent to the English language, and that ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba, that heartbeat. But then, almost inevitably, when we're coming upon a fight, a character then breaks out of that rhythm. There's something in that breaks, and I think that's a great. It's a great tell for us to see. This character's no longer thinking logically, or they're no longer acting in a way that's in their best interest, or acting rationally. Now they are letting their emotions take over. They're now no longer thinking through. They've stopped making these wonderful, articulate, beautiful arguments for whatever their point of view is, and they just say, "Have at thee," and they attack. And one of my favorite examples is is Romeo in Paris, when Romeo's at Juliet's tomb, and he says all this beautiful language, and it's this beautiful language of like, thou maw, thou womb of death, gorged with the dearest morsel of the earth. I mean, oh man, just beautiful, beautiful language. And then Paris shows up, and he says, he says, can then villain go with me, thou must die. And Romeo says, indeed I must, and therefore came I hither. And he's still in this wonderful, beautiful language. And then Paris rejects his explanation. Romeo is begging him to go away. Please don't tempt a desperate man. I have come here armed against myself. And Paris says, I don't believe you, and moves to attack him. And then finally Romeo says, wilt thou provoke me? Then have at thee, boy. And there's a little spring in there in the language, and clearly it's like Romeo's now turning on the engines and ready to jump into it. So usually that's a good indication for me. Beyond that, there's again that room for interpretation for me as a director of, from one show to the next. Do I see this fight as a little bit more like when I've done sword fights with Macbeth and Seward, where Seward is ready to fight and Macbeth is just like letting him come and just staying very cool, calm, and collected, and just letting him come at him until he makes a mistake and then takes his head off. But I've also done it where Macbeth just like brutally like knocks him to the ground and just beats him up, as opposed to, and then you can look at similarly, I did play around with our fight in our production with Macbeth and Macduff, where the openings, it's a knife fight where, for those who haven't seen, Macbeth pulls his gun, and Macduff says, with my, I have no words, my voice is in my steel, and shows his gun. And then Macbeth intentionally puts his gun down, saying, as easy as may is thou the entrenched air with thy keen knife, impressively complete. Little alterations of words, but keeping the rhythm of the verse. And encourages him to, draw your knife. And the opening bout is a pretty nice, even bout between them until Macbeth gets wounded, and then Macduff says, despair thy charm, and let the angel whom thou still hast served tell thee Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. Macbeth says, the prophecy. And then from then on out, the fight is no longer even. I'm giving Macbeth moves that are much more desperate, and they get bound up and tied up a little bit more, and it's all done in the service of he is now no longer fighting with the assurance that I'm definitely going to win. He's now realizing, he's feeling the weight of his mortality settle upon him, and the prophecy is now nipping at his heels. So I play around with the rhythm in that way as well in these fights.
I love that explanation, and I love how it connects back to the storytelling aspect of these scenes, of these moments where you're creating a story within the movement of these actors. Okay, so obviously theater is kind of where you hang your hat. Mm-hmm. Is there a movie though, because a lot of us can't go to see a production and it be the same production?
Absolutely.
So is there a movie out there where you're like, that scene, that moment, that is what creating that story is all about? Absolutely.
There's no shortage of favorite movies. It's one of the things we'll talk about whenever we're at one of these combat workshops, events. We'll talk about our favorite scenes and various things. And matter of fact, at the last combat workshop, it came up that a few of the students hadn't seen certain movies, and we said, "Oh, you have to see it!" And so we were talking about that. And there's a variety of them. My absolute favorite film of all time, even before I got into stage combat, it was my favorite film of all time, is Princess Bride. I think it's a perfect blend. Yes. It's a perfect blend. For me, it's a perfect movie. Honestly, it's got romance, it's got comedy, it's got drama, it's got all the wonderful elements, and some amazing sword fighting to boot. Matter of fact, interestingly enough, not this past Valentine's Day, but Valentine's Day before that, the Independent Movie Theater down here contacted me and asked if I would help recreate the famous Inigo Montoya Man in Black fight live in front of the screen. They did a live event where audience members were doing a lot of stuff, yelling back at the screen, and I grabbed one of my students who was very adept, and I said, "Hey, for the next month, you and I are learning this fight." And oh my goodness, that fight is so long. I think that, and that fight is very much it's very much its own thing, but it's absolutely a love letter to the old Hollywood films and swashbuckling of Basil Rathbone and Errol Flynn. Just everything about that fight from start to finish, it's just beautifully done. And those guys worked for months on that fight to get it up to that speed, and they did amazing work on it. A recent example would be the John Wick movies are very, very entertaining, but of particular interest to me. I mean, I think they're all fun, but the first one I think is, again, almost a perfect film when it comes to looking at movement and choreography. And an example of this would be, it's understood, and it's very rarely shown in film, that people who are trained, like combat veterans and or I guess in this case hitmen, are trained with firearms. If they know they're going to be in a firefight, they know to never let their gun go dry. Because if you let your gun go dry to the point that you're going click, 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 and there's no bullets, that you have not planned accordingly, and you're going to run the risk of, of dead time, and that's where you get injured. And throughout the film, he's constantly like shooting and dropping his clip and loading a new clip before he continues on. But there's one moment in the movie that he does go dry, and it's in the I believe it's in the club scene, and his gun goes dry. He even has a moment where he looks at it like he's lost count, and shortly thereafter, he suffers a grievous wound. He pays for it. And also, I think the movie's a great example of, so often in these movies, pretty much every movie, every character that has a fight in it, the characters are basically superheroes. They get hit, they go down for a second, and then they just hop back up and smack some dirt on it and move on. Yeah, it's just a scratch. It's always just a scratch. But in that movie in particular, he takes a wound, and everything for the rest of the movie, all of his choreography is loaded with that wound. He's slowing down, he's having to favor it. I think it's some brilliant, brilliant work. And that movie was shot and created by fight guys who were the best in the business. So they knew what they were doing, and there was a chance for them to get to tell a story they wanted to tell it. Another one that I love is the recent Puss in Boots movie, The Last Wish. It's a beautiful anime movie. Deserved a lot more attention than it got. And it was another one with some wonderful, beautiful storytelling through the fighting. Just because animation, you can do so many things that you can't do in live action. And they were able to do so much with the camera, quote unquote, to either show the tilted view of things, or to get this really great forced perspective, and this whole story of a character who's literally fighting against his own mortality, or more specifically his fear of his mortality. I think was really, really wonderfully done. He wasn't actually fighting death; he was fighting him, something within himself. We could spend this whole podcast just talking about movies that I love with fights.
Those are amazing examples. I love each and every one of them. And so, as we're talking about your own productions,
yes,
the ones that you have been fight director of, which one would you call out as one that really stood out for you, and why?
I recently directed for the third time. I did a fight direction for the play She Kills Monsters at Oklahoma City University. And first, that one stood out to me because our director, Dr. Inga Zatinsky, who teaches theater history at OCU, she, from the very start, she understood that this is a show that has a lot of fighting in it. It's about fantasy, epic fights with monsters and warriors and all this great stuff. And so she understood right from the get-go, we need to set a lot of time for fighting. And that's probably one of our most common complaints as fight directors. They never give us enough time, but we make it work anyway. But she came to me and said, how much time do you want? And I thought I was being a little greedy. I said, could I have 2 days a week? And she said, how about I give you half the rehearsal time? She gave me half the rehearsal time, and it showed. That whole show was brilliant, wonderful, so much fun to work on. And that show means a lot to me too, because amongst other things, unsurprisingly, like many in the fight community, I'm also very much into tabletop RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons. I've been playing for over 20 years, so that play has a special place in my heart. And it's a play about people finding community and finding their identity through storytelling, and using that as a means, again, of connecting with other people. So that production was a particular joy to me. I also got to fight direct and really do all of the movement for a production of The Play That Goes Wrong that we did as a co-production with our university and Lyric Theater of Oklahoma. And that one's just fun because it's start to finish, wall-to-wall movement tricks and clowning and people falling on their faces, and they're up on a balcony, and the balcony drops halfway and they have to hold on, and then at one point the balcony drops, and I had an actor who stepped out of a door onto nothing and did a wall run and then jumped and landed and did a roll. It was so much fun, and so there's that was another recent show that stood out to me. It's just one that I absolutely loved. And then I'll just say one that I both fight directed and directed was Kate Hamill's Dracula, a feminist revenge fantasy. We did that last year at OCU, and that was another example where the fights were not very in depth. And that, I think that's something that people often assume, is that I'm only called in when the fights are huge. I'm there if I can just be there for if there just needs to be a slap or a fall. And in that show, like there were a few scuffles, but it's mostly this kind of very methodical, like feeling of like they can't fight Dracula. He's this larger than life character, and he's incredibly powerful. But they were still like these moments and scuffles and all these things, and getting to look at those beats moment to moment and see the character revelation through the movement really was a wonderful exploration for me and for our students, and they did a fantastic job with that show as well.
So hearing about all these amazing skills that went well, right? You just talked about basically it sounds like parkour.
Yeah, Play That Goes Wrong. We were running and jumping and falling off levels and hitting mats and tumbling out windows.
So in all of your time doing this, has there been an oh shit moment? Has there been a moment where things have gone horribly awry?
Oh, absolutely. It's, I mean, my job, a large part of my job is to do everything I can to try to anticipate what could go wrong and then try to mitigate that and plan backup plans and B plans and C plans and Z plans for it. But we do everything we can to try to plan accordingly. But there will always be something that will just fall apart, and suddenly you have to adjust. I've had actors, I've thankfully, knock on wood, have not had anyone be horribly injured, but whether someone's hit their hand or it's just something's gone not quite right, and you have to adjust. Thankfully, nothing has gone terribly, horribly wrong, and that's honestly that's my goal. If I want to tell good stories, I want to teach stage combat and share with everybody my love of storytelling through movement. But at the end of the day, if at the end of my life I can walk away and say no one was horribly injured, I kept everybody relatively safe on every show that I worked on, that's success for me, and that's our end goal. No show is worth the health and safety of someone.
I'm so impressed that you have such an amazing record in terms of safety and everything. I taught kids CrossFit for a long time, and it was just body awareness, and yet I had a kid trip over their own shoelaces and break their arm, and I was just...
There's a reason I teach at a university. I took an education class to teach high school students for one semester when I was in college, and I realized very quickly, ooh, I don't want to do this. I say that, but now I'm going to be teaching some classes to some high school students high school students at Kismet Art Studio here in OKC.
Maybe it'll be a little better because they want to be there.
Oh, I'm sure, and I've also built the classes intentionally, kind of planned for that as well as I can. But you're right. I mean, I would say probably the biggest recent injury we saw was at this combat workshop. I was working with one of our level 2 students she's a dancer. She's very aware of her body. One of the best student combatants that I've ever worked with. Like, she just learns stuff so well, and she has great control of her body, and she knows how to do falls properly and release energy and not hold tension in your body. Wonderful work. And yet, your body will sometimes just surprise you. She went to the ground to do a fall, and it wasn't a bad fall, didn't hit hard or anything, but as she kind of went down, she just knocked her shoulder out of play, out of the socket just a little bit, and I wasn't in there to see it. One of the other instructors, and then they came to me and they said, Kris, somebody's knocked their shoulder out of their socket, and I come in and I look at it, like, oh, And thankfully, I have been trained in some in basic first aid and how that kind of thing. We were able to get her taken care of. She's fine, and she was able to do the rest of the work for the workshop without any further injury. But it happens, and that's the other thing is that like we plan to teach things as safely as we can, and then we plan how to deal when life happens and something will inevitably go wrong at some point. But if we do all of our work on the front end, whenever it does go wrong, it'll probably go wrong in a more manageable way than terrible catastrophe.
Yes, you hear about some horrible events gone wrong on film sets or stages.
And every time one of those stories hits the news, again, all of us in the community, we're all talking and we're all saying, and even without knowing what's going on, we'll see the news stories. And we'll be able to point to it and say, just from the news story, not even having seen all the stuff, just from the news story, I can tell this, and this went wrong, or I can tell that they probably didn't do this. And so we're trained in technique, we're trained in like how to teach things, but a lot of our training is also built around like the safety that's behind all the technique and stuff that we don't necessarily divulge all that to our students because their brains can only hold so much, but we're aware of it. So
right.
It's like half the job right there.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting because the theaters that I've toured and gone to, like I went to the Old Globe this summer, and they had their armory.
Yeah.
And they were like, yeah, we had to lock everything up because some of our high school students would just grab some blades and start fighting.
Yeah, because they're very enthusiastic, and I get it. I did it too. It was so much fun. But yeah, we have to put things under lock and key, and got to make sure we keep them safe. And yes, they are fun, but we respect. We still treat them with respect. Like I said, I'm not a big gun nut, but when we were working with our firearms, and our firearms are not real firearms. They're all either dummy guns, solid pieces of metal or plastic or rubber, or they are functional replicas where they look like they're real guns, but they can never be loaded, they can never be fired. And yet, even then, I'm still like, from day one, I'm saying, we're going to treat this like a real gun. We're never going to point them at anybody, because it's always understood if you point a gun at something, you should be prepared to destroy it. And and again, I know many of my students appreciate the safety. Some of them might roll their eyes a little bit every time when I'm like holding a solid piece of rubber and I'm saying, this is not loaded. And they're like, yeah, duh, I know. But I'm still going to tell you it is not loaded, because I want every single time you ever touch a firearm, regardless of what type it is, I want you to know whether or not it's loaded. And again, that's because I never want to have a horrible accident happen on my sets.
Well, and I feel like the more you love certain things, the more you understand the importance of knowing how to work with them. Like I have 5 swords, I have 26 other sharp miscellaneous objects from
Yeah, but you learn to respect them.
Exactly.
You understand, yes, that you can appreciate their beauty, you can appreciate them for I can appreciate a firearm for the beautiful, wonderful craftsmanship that went into it and all the things that work perfectly to make this thing do what it's supposed to do. While I also respect the fact that this has a lot of power to rend and tear and destroy and end lives with it, and I'm not afraid of it. I treat it with respect,
right? Just
like everything else. And yes, a solid piece of metal. I mean, this sword that we have sitting on our table, this is not a real sword. It has never been sharpened. It never will be sharpened. It's not designed for that. And yet, this still is a solid piece of metal that if I wanted to, if I handed it to somebody, they could whack somebody over the head and do some damage with it. So we still treat it with respect, even when we're playing around. And I think we were talking about injuries, and this literally just came to me. I think the worst injury I've ever had that I've been involved in has actually been to myself. And it was a very good learning point where, and it was when I was working with other instructors and we were exploring what we could physically do, what kind of crazy moves. It's things we would never show students, but in the process of that, I got poked a little bit. It's nothing horrible, but I was like, oh, good reminder not to do that. It's a great learning experience, and a reminder that no matter how comfortable we get with these things, we should always respect them and respect the process, respect the craft, because it is just that. It is a craft.
So, since this is the Shakespearean Shrew, I have to ask a couple of questions, and one of them is, of Shakespeare's works, which would you say is, well, and you can even say your favorite play, you can say your favorite character, you can say your favorite line.
Okay.
Or you can give me the trifecta.
Okay. My favorite play is King Lear. I have, I love it. It's this beautiful, wonderful, it's a beautiful tragedy that at times feels like a history, but it's, it's completely made up, but it's also this wonderful story of, at its heart, it is a story of a family, inner family conflict that's being, personal, private conflict that's being played out on the public stage. I think the characters are wonderful. I think Lear is so compelling. The secondary story of Edmund and Edgar, that.
Well, and I love that you brought this one up, because I was just talking about this one because it's a comedy until the end where everybody dies and you're like, wait, this could have been everybody gets married and it could have been a comedy.
Like with King Lear, there could have it could have ended happily. It could have. It very much has a lot of that conflict where, there's conspiring, and there's plenty of examples of Shakespeare's plays where there's this horrible conspirators happening, but then it ends. I mean, the fact that, look at The Tempest, that begins with a horrible shipwreck and people being separated on the island and thinking they're dead, and it could have ended horribly, and it could have ended with Prospero getting his revenge, but instead it resolves in forgiveness. It resolves in it resolves in reconciliation, and I think that's beautiful. To that end, my goodness, so many different lines, but I think one of my favorite lines is from The Tempest, and it is it's in that moment when Prospero decides that he is going to no longer torture his traitorous his traitorous brother, and he's no longer going to make everybody pay. He's going to release them from his magic, bring them all together at his cell, and be the agent of reunification. And in that line, when he's talking to Ariel, he realizes the rarer action is in virtue, not in vengeance. And I love that. I wrote my graduate school thesis on The Tempest. I directed The Tempest, and that's one of those lines that has always stuck with me. Matter of fact, I have a tattoo that's from our production of that play that I just that I carry with me, because the story of a man who has every right to hold on to his hate. He was banished. He and his daughter were cast out, essentially to die. He has every reason to have taught her to hate the world and hate everybody in it, and instead she's been brought up with curiosity and wonder, and in this moment when he has everybody in his hands, he realizes this will not bring the resolution that he thinks it will. He realizes, no, I must forgive. I could take vengeance, but I will not. So I think that is a beautiful, wonderful, fascinating example of what this work is all about. And I mean, I think it's really beautiful that is Shakespeare's final play.
Yeah. So you mentioned some of my favorite plays, King Lear. I mean, obviously we've been talking about Macbeth, where we've got some gruesome scenes, and really, you all as directors decided to kill the king on stage, which of course is unheard of in Elizabethan England.
Yeah. Yes.
But we're bringing it in, and I thought it was such an interesting decision because usually people don't die on stage.
Yeah.
They die off stage where they can, scream in private. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think it's one of the hardest things to do, to die on stage.
Yeah.
Everybody's waiting to see, like Romeo and Juliet. Everyone's waiting to see, are they actually dead? Are they gonna breathe? Is she breathing? Romeo, look, she's breathing.
Yeah.
And then, and you're just like, oh, wait. And so even when they actually die, everybody's staring at them. And as an actor, you have to breathe.
Yeah.
It's one of those mandatory
it's one of the
things.
early tricks you learn. It's like, okay, I'm supposed to be dead. How do I breathe into a different part of my body so my chest isn't rising? Yeah, it's one of those skills.
So why bring death on stage? Why do you think Shakespeare does it, and why would would you decide that as a choice?
It started with the directors. They wanted to have it on stage, and I believe they were inspired, by the recent Denzel Washington film version of Macbeth. They were inspired by a scene from that, but it was really just this idea of, and you mentioned Romeo and Juliet, I think that's another perfect example of what I'm about to say. What happens in the moment of death? In the example of Romeo and Juliet, it's the moment when one character chooses to take their life as the other is actually waking up from a supposed death. And then you can stage that a number of ways. Do they see each other or does he die first and then she wakes up and finds his dead body? I directed Romeo and Juliet here right before the pandemic, and I timed it so that Romeo drinks the poison, and as he is slowly being overwhelmed, he sees Juliet stir. He has no lines, but he sees her stir, and as she's saying, Romeo, and looks up, and they lock eyes for just a brief moment before he then closes them. And there's a really powerful thing that happens in that moment. As a movement person, I'm very interested in the storytelling that happens between the lines. I'm very interested in what happens. So some of the most powerful moments that I've been able to either fight direct or be a part of on stage as an actor even, are the moments that happen between the lines when characters just lock eyes, when they're sharing a silent moment on stage and it's just two bodies in space, breath, how do they move, how do they hold themselves. And for our production of Macbeth, it's the idea that Duncan is not just some higher, some lord to Macbeth. He's not just his king, he's a friend. He is someone he has known probably his whole life, and someone that he expresses before this his reluctance, his fear, his concern at going through with this, and that's why Lady Macbeth tells him, "Screw your courage to the sticking place. You must do this." She's the one that kind of pushes him to this because Macbeth rightfully has concerns and fears about this. And so, what does it mean to look another person in the eye who is not just another person, not another human being, but someone who is very close to you, who may be a father figure to you, or at least a very close friend, and to then drive the blade in. So we staged it with that moment where Macbeth comes in and he has the knives and he sits down at the bed and he's like ready to do it, and then he hesitates for just a moment. And as he hesitates, Duncan awakes and looks at him, and first Macbeth is just like, "Shh, no, it's okay," and tries to push him down, but then Duncan resists, and it's now that escalation of action of, he could have just come in, stabbed him, and left, but instead he hesitated, he waited. And because he waited, things got a little more out of hand, and then it descends into a struggle where he has to put his hand over his mouth and keep him from screaming, and also has to plunge in this knife, and he's trying so desperately hard to just end it as quickly as he can, but the killing of someone that you're supposed to love, that you're supposed to be so close to, it can't be that easy. We felt like Macbeth had to work for it, and in doing so, he lost some of his humanity in that moment. So that was what really prompted that decision and that exploration of that moment on stage.
It was a very powerful moment on the stage.
And again, I think that's a great example of, for movement-wise, not a complex thing that we did as far as the actual choreography. The choreo is very, very simple in that, but we did spend a lot of time like fine-tuning. It's this moment of, first he's just trying to push him back to lie down, and then he resists and has to put his hand over his mouth, and then they're struggling over the knife, and then it slowly descends until it plunges in. Like, it was all of this exploration of like one beat to the next as it slowly builds in tension and slowly builds in stakes to where now Macbeth can't turn back.
Okay. So I actually was introduced to you because you are on the board of OSP. What brought you to the board? Why did you decide to join the board?
I was invited by our artistic director, Tyler Woods. He had expressed an interest in first just getting more people on the board, and a big part of it was, I believe a big reason is because I'm a professor with Oklahoma City University, and we've had a relationship with OSP for a long time now, and we wanted to continue that relationship. I think there's a lot to be gained from both sides to support one another and to foster the arts here in Oklahoma City. And that's the other thing, is that I moved to Oklahoma City from a very rural area in Mississippi. I was teaching at a very small college in Mississippi. The closest professional theater I could get to was a couple hours away. The next closest was like 6 hours away. Professional work was very hard to come by. When I moved to Oklahoma City, I moved here with the express purpose of, I want to teach theater, I want to teach stage combat and acting and all this wonderful stuff. But I also wanted to feed into the community here. I wanted to feed into the artistic community. I didn't know anything about Oklahoma City before I moved here. All I knew about was the bombing, and I knew about the musical, and that was it. And then I was very surprised to get here and see there's so much theater here, there's so much art here, there's such a wonderful, diverse community here. I did not expect that, and I was very thrilled to see that there was a vibrant theatrical community that I could pour myself into, that I could dedicate myself to. And so when Tyler approached me and asked me, it was an absolute and an immediate yes for me, because I think the work that OSP is doing here, along with all the other theaters here, is vital. I think it's vital to the soul of any community, to encourage the arts, to encourage folks to be a part of the arts in whatever way they can. And if I can, in some small way, help spread the word about that, support that work, then I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to be on the front lines, and I moved here with that purpose in mind, so I felt like this would be a wonderful opportunity for me to get involved, and it felt right. There was a good period where we weren't sure if we were going to be staying in Oklahoma City, just because, looking for that permanent job, and thankfully Oklahoma City University has now committed to me, and I've made them my home, and so I consider now Oklahoma City my home, and if it's my home, then you want to nurture it. And so that's what I wanted to do, is I want to be a part of this community and help nurture the wonderful art that I think is so vital to the soul of the community here.
Yeah, and I'm so excited about the Emerging Artists Collective.
Absolutely.
Because I'm hoping we can keep more of our artists here.
That, I agree, and that was something that I was so excited about, because I have no problem with folks who, take work outside of the community as well. I certainly do. Every now and then I'll get a gig somewhere and I'll go and do work, but I feel like most of my work, the lion's share, should be here. And likewise, I do not begrudge any student who comes to our university, trains in our programs, and then goes out into the world and takes that out in the world. We are very proud of our students that are working all over the country, really all over the world. But we also know that some of them are from here. Some of them come here from other places and then fall in love with Oklahoma City, and if they want to stay here, then they should have a place where they can feed into that. And so often it can be very hard for a young artist. Boy, do I remember it. It's so hard to break in. And so I think this is such a wonderful, brilliant idea to say, hey, this program is set aside for young artists who are wanting to take a step out. And it's obviously not the only one. There are other programs in the city. But I think it's such a great idea to give them a platform, give them a place where they can honestly just try something. This is a Cowboy Macbeth. That's very experimental.
Yes.
And not every theater company would be willing to take that chance. But the fact that it was that they were pretty much given the chance to run with it, and we made sure to work to make it as the best we possibly could. But they didn't have to, they had to have a fully fleshed out idea, but they didn't have to fight hard to convince somebody. That instead the canvas is laid out for them. Here, express and explore your artistic impulses here and see what you can do. That's what we should be fostering, because that's how you keep the next generations involved and they have buy-in. So I think I'm so thrilled about that, and I get to work. I mean, I already work with college students all the time, and now I'm working with recently graduated college students and these young artists who are brilliant. I'm constantly impressed by the ideas that they have and their work ethic. I mean, they have far more energy than I do. I feel like I have a pretty good energy for my age and among my colleagues, but still, they're just so eager to do it. And if they have the hunger, if they have the training, if they have the desire, then they should absolutely also have the opportunity. And so I think this is a wonderful opportunity for them to be able to spread their wings, try something, and also try in a way that they can try some ideas, and if it doesn't work out perfectly, they're not punished for it.
Right.
And so, well, you never get to do that again. Nope. Now you've learned, because that's what life is.
Well, and this one, thankfully, I mean, it's been sold out
Oh,
almost
yeah.
every night. It's been such a success, and so hopefully this will be something that keeps going.
Well, we've already got plans for next year.
Love it.
There's going to be this absolutely is going to be an ongoing thing, and so we definitely want, you know, we'll continue spreading the word, because we want all of the young artists in Oklahoma City to know, like, this is a place that if they want to get involved on this side of things, not just sitting back waiting to be cast in something, but saying, if you have the desire, the interest, the artistic impulse to take the reins and see how you can steer things a little bit, here's a place for you.